we keep on doing I, because this becomes very, very important. If you guys had I, now what exactly would I squared look like? All right, because we are, when we're applying operations, we're going to come up, Jonathan, with having I squared. We're going to have I cubed and so forth. So I squared, if you guys remember, is really just -1 times -1, right? It's really just I times I. Would you guys agree with me? OK. So the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 is equal to -1 square root of -1 squared. Well, what's the square root of something squared? Guys, what did I do? When I, over here, what is the square root of something squared? It's just x. They undo each other. They're inverse operations. So what is, sorry, it's a square. So if I take the square root, if I square the square root of something, what is it just going to equal? -1. Yeah, just like what we did over here. The square root of x squared is just x. The square root of -1 squared is just going to be -1. So therefore, I squared is equal to -1. Now let's look at I cubed. And basically, ladies and gentlemen, I cubed is all that is I squared times I. Now, what did we say I squared is represented by? -1 times I. Well, I represents the square root of -1, so we're just going to leave that. So I cubed is equal to -I. You guys are going to want to write these down. I really represents the square root of -1. I squared represents -1. I cubed, so I'll write these down here. I really just represents I, or the square root of -1. I squared equals -1. I cubed equals -I. Let's do I to the fourth. I to the fourth is basically I squared times I squared.
You must love I so much.
I love i's. So I squared represents what?
I.
-1 times -1. What's -1 times -1? Positive 1.
Which is I.
No, it's not I. So I to the fourth represents I. You guys are going to want to make sure you have this handy today when you're doing your work. Now, I'm not going to do anything to the fifth, but let's look at that. I to the fifth is basically I to the fourth times I. Yes? Do you guys agree that's like I to the fourth times the next power?
If you can put
Okay.
this in a Dora episode, this would be.
Yes.
So would that just make it -1?
I'll go to it in a second.
Why does it say I 3 is negative?
Because I cubed is I squared times I. Do you agree with that or not? Yes. OK. I squared is -1. So -1 times I is just -I. OK? So in this one, so the I to the fifth would be really I to the fourth times I. Well, what's I to the fourth? 1 times I. What's 1 times I?
Wait, how is I to the fourth 1 times
I to the fourth. No, I to the fourth is just 1. I mean I to the fifth? Saying I to the fifth?
Yeah.
OK. Think about this.
Oh, I get it now. I get it.
It's just, think of it just like variables. X to the fifth is equal to x to the fourth times x.
I got it.
Right? That'd be x to the fifth. You agree? So it's just like using with variables. So what I want you guys to understand is I to the fifth goes back. It starts again. This just keeps on repeating itself. So therefore, I to the sixth, using that pattern, what do you guys think I to the sixth would be? Just by going with the pattern. -1.
Negative.
And you guys can keep on going. I to the seventh. I to the eighth equals 1. Right? But basically, you guys just need to know the first 4. That's all you really need to know. OK, Abby?